Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your day to join us for the webinar. This is actually going to be the Jamie Show, and I hope to basically talk through a few ideas and thoughts that we are, conversations that we're having with our current partners and things that I've done in the industry. So let's not wait any longer. Let's get started. So we all know that Melt is, well, here's a little bit about me first, just so you understand who I am. I have been in the higher ed industry for about 13 years. I live outside of Philadelphia. And for those of you who know the Philadelphia marketplace for higher ed, within 100 miles, there's about 100 universities. So my time as a director of admissions in the Philadelphia marketplace was very, very cutthroat and filled with melt prevention. So that's why I'm coming to you live today with this webinar. I want to put a few thoughts out there, a few caveats, because melt is a strange thing, right? We all have different factors, and I highlighted this a little bit in the intro video if you saw that to this webinar. We all have unique factors on our campus that potentially lead to melt, maybe some geographic factors, maybe programmatic things that are going on. What I'm going to attempt to do today is really talk on a general level, and hopefully at least everyone who's on the phone or listening in will get a little bit of goodness from it. The topics for today, let's talk a little bit about a brief definition of melt. We're going to talk through the major causes of melt, a pretty extensive list, I think, of solutions, and probably a lot of kind of other references to things that I don't even have in the PowerPoint, and then some diagnostic questions for you to ask and helpful resources. All right, so summer melt can be viewed from two different lenses. Obviously, there's the lens that we're all looking at it from. If you're out there in the college or university enrollment management lens, and that is listed right there on the top. Traditionally used, students pay a deposit to attend a particular school, and then they don't matriculate when it comes to the fall. For some of you, this time of the year, like even this week, is like a big retraction week where you're losing, like students are saying, I want a refund on my deposit because I've chosen another institution. And then for others, it happens over the summer for various reasons, which we'll get into. The second definition, as pointed out in the lower portion, is the high school definition. I never really thought much about this. I've never been involved, even though my wife was a high school teacher. I'd never thought about the value that many schools place on actually getting out of high school and going to college. But it's very similar to kind of our placement rates in the college ed, like in the alumni office and graduate placements and things like that. So I'm assuming that there's a lot of pride and value that goes into students who are leaving high school and coming to college, and I'm sure high schools like to boast on their high percentage. So those are the two lenses. We are mainly going to look at the top lens. Obviously, we're all in or I shouldn't say all, but most of us are probably in the college and college enrollment ed space, higher ed, and so we're going to use the top definition. So again, everyone has unique factors. Like that is the thing that's going to be prevailing. You're going to notice that even when I was a director of admission, I feel like there were some years where we had one thing was a big deal, and then other years it was another thing. I think that as students change and as technology changes, some of the factors change. Your campus obviously has unique factors, but these are the three prevailing roadblocks that are present in many melt situations: cost, social anxiety, and informational barriers. Now, hopefully all of you are out there shaking your cyber heads right now because you understand what I'm talking about. And in some cases, if you've been in enrollment management for any amount of time, you know that this is the time of the year when there's a lot of conversations about cost. There's a lot of pressure to have a great accepted student day because you want that social anxiety to be a factor that's kind of a quiet factor. And you want your website to be filled with clear process, and you want the folks who are involved in the later on down the road thing, like residence life and health and all that, health forms and things like that, you want that to be flawless, because we don't need to give students another reason to back away from our institutions. We want everything to go well. so that we can retain them right through to move-in day. My staff team and I always used to have a joke that some people would say, oh yeah, it's not final until September or August when move-in weekend happens, and I was always like, no, it's not final until 2 weeks after move-in, once the ad drop is over, because that's when census and you take the pulse on how students are really doing. So as we talk through solutions today, what I want to do is really highlight those three things: cost, social anxiety, and informational barriers, and really talk through what are we doing to address those. Pardon me. So the question, a friend of mine who's been in higher ed for probably longer than I've been alive uses a reference to military weaponry, and I've probably used this before if you've ever been in another webinar that I've done, but military weaponry, over time, obviously it changes, right? Like the Civil War had different weapons than the United States uses today. However, there's still a place for certain tools in certain situations. So the question becomes, first question I think everyone has to wrestle with in this process of MELT is this an old school situation, or is this a new school? Or is there a combination of both of these factors when we address situations that we should employ? So hopefully within the presentation today, you'll be able to see an assortment, because I think it would be a terrible tragedy if at the end of this presentation, we were only thinking, oh, well, what are the new vendors that we need to add to the list? What are the new tactics that we need to put into place for next year? Rather than going back and saying, hey, what have been the historic touch points in the process that we need to really look at and make sure that they're really working the way they were originally designed, even if they were originally designed, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, or maybe longer ago than that. So this is kind of an old school slide, and I wanted to just point out the fact that it is old school. So that's why I put the old school stamp on it. One of the things that really is a critical point to think about, obviously when it comes to cost factors, is the FAFSA. There are many people in the industry who believe that the application is not complete until the FAFSA is submitted. And I used to push against that and think about it and argue against it. However, I think there's a lot of truth in that. If you don't have a student's FAFSA, then everything else is really a secondary question. Like the FAFSA is, for most students, like a very critical thing. So I have on my little flow chart up here at the top, have your incoming families submitted a FAFSA, yes or no? If yes, one of the things, and this is maybe MELT 101 or Financial Aid 101. I know Amanda, when we were talking through this information, and put her financial aid hat on and said, this is something that they did too. One of the things that we always did when I was the director of admission was to do assurance calls. The package goes out. I would buy pizza for my staff. We would get the financial aid staff involved, and we would basically do a calling blitz, or like a few weeks worth of call nights, where we were reaching out and just making sure that a few things happened. One, they received the financial aid package. And two, and I think more importantly, that the recipients understood what they were looking at. I think that can be, especially for first-generation families, that can be a big, scary process that needs to be addressed right away. If the answer is no, and they're not planning to apply you fill out the FAFSA, they have a high EFC, and they don't want the government to know how much money they make or whatever, then that's fine. That's not a big deal. You can call them and thank them for applying and depositing and all that. And then the last part is they haven't submitted and they don't understand the process. So really, the top and the bottom, in many cases, can accomplish the same thing. The bottom one is, do you understand it? Obviously you made it through it. But do you understand all this that you get back? And then the top one is, you don't understand the actual process to file. How can we help you do that? And the big question, the internal process questions that I'd like everyone to ask is our communication plan
giving us all the information that we need? Are we leveraging what information we collect, which I think happens a lot in the admissions world? We don't. And then if not, big one, this is a big one, hold on. If not, what changes can you make today or this week, maybe after May 1st week? What changes can you make in order to change that process? Sometimes it might be little changes. One of the things that I think every office probably should wrestle with is reliance on a single form of communication. And what do I mean by that? I think sometimes what happens is if we here we have the old way, my 3 bullet points over there: email 25 times, attempt to call, and hope for a reply. Like, it's just like, okay, here's how it goes. I hope it works out well. I'm going to just do the same old thing over and over and hope that we can make some ground along the way. If we're not getting a response through a mode of communication that we have been using, here's what we have to do. Stop using that communication and try something else. We live in an age where there's so many ways to communicate. Hopefully, you'll have at your disposal another opportunity to communicate in some way. So here are 3 different ways that we're going to talk about for different types of communication. A multi-channel approach is obviously going to be the most effective. It's going to offer a lot of opportunities for reception and response, and essentially, at the end of the day, it's going to give you the opportunity to push those families and students to take the next step. Or I shouldn't even say push, because it's really more of an assist. How can I get you to take the next step? How can I walk with you along the way in order to make that happen? So let's talk a little bit about marketing automation. Chapter does a lot of marketing automations. There's a lot of other companies out there that do marketing automation. A quick definition of marketing automation is essentially you identify a particular type of audience. If that audience comes to your website and has that select some filters that are applied to them, then they get some messaging. Okay, that's kind of an elementary definition of marketing automation. It comes in a whole bunch of different forms. This is one way. This survey that you see here on the bottom right, that is one way that marketing automation can be fulfilled. And here's a great example, I think, of a melt prevention marketing automation tactic. And just so you know, this is actually something that we just put into place with one of the partners that I work with here in Pennsylvania. And I expect the results to be really good, because here, I'll talk through that in a second. Hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself. So this audience that this is going to, Fall 19 admitted students who haven't yet deposited. The big question could be, like, what's preventing you from choosing, fill in the blank on your institution. You can put any number of choices in there that you want. Super easy response mechanism. This is going to show up in the middle of that website experience for that user, and it's going to basically either make them respond, or it's going to make them cancel out of it. Either way, they've got to do a click or two, and it's super easy to elicit a response. And on the back end of this, what I love about these is that it is like a treasure trove of information. Like, you can get so much feedback from a audience. And think about this as it applies to non-melt situations. You can get about, hey, what's keeping you from applying? What's keeping you from making a campus visit? Like all sorts of different ways to do it. We trigger email responses based on their selection sets for this one, just to give a next step. It's just a really slick way of gathering information. And especially in this case, like, I'm not sure I can make it work financially. That's going to be a big one for a lot of people. And that gives us an open door to come back in and talk with that student and family about, what are those things? Like, okay, how can we make it work for you financially? Another opportunity that's really, I think, taken off a lot, CRM, Slate, different tools have texting options built into them. And it's become an incredible way to get students to respond. I mean, I remember when I, was getting into higher ed, and there was just such that's like, oh, email's everything, and everyone is, going email crazy. And I think that we still overuse email to a great degree, but it's lost its power, right? It's a branding tool now. There's some opportunity to get parental interaction with it, but it's like, when it comes to the Gen Z student, like email's not doing it, not cutting it for them anymore. So texting is a super way to, again, get that experience, get right in front of the student. It's direct, it's right, it gets right to the matter at hand, and it's the good part, speaking of hands, it's actually always in their hands. I read a study that was, oh goodness, I can't remember who conducted it. Sorry, brain fail there. A study that said of Gen Z students, if they had to choose between their wallet and their phone, 72% of them would choose their phone. And if they had to give up their phone, I think 43% said they would not give up their phone for $1 million. That means it's always in their hands. It's always ready. And what I really like about it is, obviously no one wants to work through the FAFSA with, through text. Like that would be like, and then I just get sick of texting after a while. My thumbs get tired. But it's a means to open up a dialogue. Say, 4 or 5 texts go back and forth. You're talking about, financial roadblocks or FAFSA, and it's like, hey, do you mind if we, get on a quick phone call, or if we can schedule some time to go through this or something like that? And it opens up a bigger dialogue that, again, gets that student and or family to kind of take the next step. I've shown here, obviously, a little fake text that I made. And then a few vendors that just do text independently. Capture actually has a partnership with Mongoose, where we do some triggered texting and some automation on the texting front, where we can, kind of similar to that previous screen, where if a certain audience comes, we can shoot a text to them if the partner has both Capture and Mongoose, which is super slick automation. But texting is a way, if you're not using texting this summer with your staff team, I would try to figure out a way to do it. And there are some workarounds, like if you want to, I'm not going to do this over the phone because there's probably some people who really don't really care, but if you want to talk through an interesting way to work through the texting paradigm without paying for a vendor, shoot me an email, which you'll probably get a response. You'll get an email response after this webinar with my email in it. Shoot me an email, and I would love to kind of give you the way that we did that when I was a director of admissions at a school who had no budget. Triggered messaging and direct mail. Again, let's think back through the comments on the old arsenal. And there are a lot of people in higher ed that think, oh, direct mail is for the birds. It's too expensive. There's no ROI. It's very, it's very difficult to put it all together. You have to reprint it every year. The list goes on and on. And I don't disagree, right? I don't disagree. It's hard to measure. It's expensive. But you know what, though? You raise your hand proverbially. I can't see your response, but raise your hand if you actually like getting mail. Like maybe you're in my age category where you're starting to think about college for your own kids. Maybe you're younger. I mean, there's something about getting a piece of mail, especially when it's personal and it's directed to you and it has an actual point. Like, I don't like getting a bunch of things from an insurance company saying I need to change, or stuff from a cable company. But when it has to do with my future and college, I think there's something still about getting a piece of mail that makes a difference. What you see here on the screen is a triggered direct mail piece that we actually did. Now we post-dated it up. Post-date's our fake college at Capture. We made that up. It's not a real place. You cannot go visit there. They do not have open houses. But we made this picture, and the copy is actually from a real campaign that we did, sending students to a specific landing page for a special gift, a welcome gift at orientation. And it's a handwritten note. It's a cool technology, but it was triggered on them coming to the website, and it created this great VIP experience. This is like very, very personal, and it played really well. We got great responses from it. It was just a really neat way to use some old school thinking and old school communication mechanisms with some modern flair. So those are 3 things that you can do, on the marketing automation side. And actually, there's a bunch of different things that a bunch of other things that can be done, and obviously we just have time constraints, so I can't cover all of them. And this isn't a sales demo, so I want to make sure that you're getting some ideas that you can like grab onto and put into your toolbox to use potentially this summer. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about some social mechanisms. One of the partners I work with has been doing some really cool things on with social this year. And obviously, you know, we all know that like social anxiety that students face, it's a big deal, right? I mean, in Philadelphia, when I was the director of admissions, one of the things that I really, really liked was getting a phone call from a student after another school had their not their open house, but like their orientation or their accepted student day. And it was like, you knew how the day went by just talking with the student, because somehow they went to accepted student day over at college B, and at college C, they were back on the line like the next week because that experience wasn't good. And unfortunately, like that is the way it is sometimes. If the student goes to an open house, it goes to an experience on campus and doesn't enjoy it, or doesn't feel like they're connecting with the people that they're around, then that's a big roadblock and it's a big hurdle, and it can lead to a student pulling away during the summer. So the use of social media, I think, is clutch, right? Like not only creating kind of memories and mechanisms for getting students connected with each other, but also using some of the messaging options that are now available. So I'm going to tell you about one particular partner that I have that does something super cool, and you can steal it. I would think that they'd be okay with that. But for their acceptances, one of the things that they did this year is they took student callers out of the process, right? Like they used to have a lot of calling campaigns. They did a lot of stuff like, hey, congratulations on your acceptance. I'm a current student. I'm in your major, et cetera, et cetera. They stopped doing that. And instead what they did was that they took their student workforce and they used Instagram to do direct message video to say, hey, this is Jamie, and I'm from Philadelphia just like you, and I'm studying here in California at this school. And I can't wait to meet you next year, or can't wait to meet you in the fall. We're so excited about your acceptance. Send video. Okay, so remember back at the beginning of the webinar when I said there might be some things that you need to put on your list of information points to collect. One of the things that I would think about if I were you is what are the handles or the usernames or things like that that might be beneficial to collect in the future, in order to make some of these tools possible. So obviously, when you're sending Instagram messages, you want to make sure you're sending it to the right person. We've all heard horror stories about stuff getting sent to the wrong person. So really, like, what does it look like for you to collect Instagram handles for students who are maybe accepted, maybe on their deposit form they fill it out, you know, wherever in the pipeline you feel like you can bake something in. Then you can use that to prevent melt. You can use that to build a community. You can use that to, as it says here on the Instagram messaging part, you can create groups. So what's that look like to create social experiences that are somewhat organic? I use that word organic, so that they don't feel contrived and that students really want to participate in them in order to get social together and make some, take down some of those barriers that they might have. Obviously, we all know if you're working with Gen Z students, you know that they are very comfortable in this medium, and it's only after a certain number of times of interacting that they're actually thinking, okay, there's potential that I would like to talk with this person or do something, instead of just looking at their photos all the time. So that is something that I would encourage you to think through. How are you using social media in order to prevent melt, whether it's this year or in years to come? This next one is going like really, really, really old school, and probably really like maybe really millennial of me. However, I think that it's a worthwhile pursuit. So in the Philadelphia region, obviously, the schools I worked at were highly regional, and there were lots of Starbucks around and lots of coffee shops and music festivals and different things like that. And I actually did this. Okay, this is something that I stole from my own toolbox, and it actually worked for the school that I was at. It probably wouldn't work for everyone, and you have to have the right person. So all those caveats go into me building this up. So we got to this time of the year. My underclassmen, student ambassadors, a lot of them were leaving for the summer, but I had this one particular ambassador that was just a rock star, very good with people. Took a lot of initiative. So I basically created this position called the student concierge. And I had this particular individual basically look at heat maps of where our accepted students were. And we built social events for them to come together and meet. Now, these weren't like massive events. Don't like the schools I worked at were not massive institutions that brought in classes of, 15,000 or even 10,000 or even 5,000. But they were they were concentrated in areas where we had students. I would say they were concentrated in areas where we had current students. And what we did is built a critical mass enough to say, hey, it's worth us putting together an event so that we can go and we can host people and they can come and meet face to face. This was later on in the summer. I shouldn't say we weren't doing this in April. We weren't doing this in May. It was more like July and August, like as a warm up to orientation. We paid everything to do it, and it was a very interesting experiment, and I would say it was an experiment that worked. Essentially, what the call to action is here, as you look at this slide, is how can you create kind of these low impact and almost low risk events where students are okay to come and say, hey, yeah, I'll have a cup of coffee with you, or I'll talk about, whether it's having a professor there or an advisor or something like that, where it's like they're getting a little bit of a glimpse of what college will look like, because I think that's key. Community is a key thing to create. All right, let me grab a drink of water here. Thank you for that time. So one of the last things that I think is a part of everyone's process is the matter of informational roadblocks. We all in the enrollment management space, we probably operate on this kind of shared responsibility when it comes to orientation and student acclimation and all that kind of stuff. I don't know what your situation is, but a lot of times residence life is involved and student life is involved, or student affairs or student development or whatever it's called at your institution. There's some other departments that kind of come in, and when it kind of all starts to swirl in that vortex of information, sometimes there are things that get lost or clunky or just things that just don't work the way you want. And ultimately, those are some of the things that can come back and probably be a deterrent to some students from attending, because they think, okay, well, if this is what it's like before I get there, what's it going to be like when I do get there? I would encourage you to have just a real honest conversation, not only maybe with your counterparts at the institution, but also like, what are some of the things that you can do internally? Like what are some ways to get feedback? I know I showed that marketing automation survey earlier, and hopefully you're doing surveys and assessments, evaluations at every event, but like, what are the other ways to like garnish feedback from your staff or from financial aid of like these reoccurring problems that everyone's having and these issues and roadblocks? So, and keep a list, like carry around a notebook all the time and like keep a list of those things, because if there are things that come up that are inside your locus of control that you can impact, then it is incumbent on you to make sure that you're taking advantage of those changes that you can make, because that's going to make the difference. I would also encourage you to like think through, if you're like maybe some institutions or most institutions, or maybe let's just go with many institutions, you might have a high rate of turnover among your staff. And you might have people who are sitting on your counselor team right now who have never been through yield season. They've never been through like summer. And I remember like how discouraging that can be sometimes, where it's like, oh, you feel like you've got this big list of students who've deposited and you're feeling good, and then all of a sudden they start to peel. I would encourage you now, before that happens, like role play through some of the things that you can do in order to help them understand what is maybe going to come, or maybe some of the conversations that they might have to have with students or parents this time of the year. Listen to what the market's saying and help them, get out in front of them. Like, that is, I think, one of the responsibilities that directors and VPs have in that process, is continuing to give that educational element of, how do we get ready for this? How do we listen to the market that's around us? How do we keep those value propositions going forward to the students even after they commit? Amanda gave me a great analogy when it came to this. It was an analogy about dating and shaving and getting married, and essentially the question becomes like, when you're married, you're less likely to maybe shave every day, or to do certain things, because it's like, okay, you've done what it takes to get your spouse. And in the case of students who have deposited or are admitted, it's like, we don't want to take our foot off the gas just because we think they're coming. We want to make sure that we are paying attention to them, and that we're treating them like the high value target that they really are. Okay, these next few slides are just filled with like my harebrained maybe ideas on how to like stay out in front of the communication process when you're dealing with students, or even with parents. I have a couple of institutions that I currently work with that collect parental information, and parents can be like these huge cheerleaders in the process. And you can get a parent on board. I feel like it's just the greatest thing ever, but it's not always possible. Think about this. Think about using a service that potentially puts you in front of the student in a different way, right? No one likes necessarily voicemail. I look at my wife's phone sometimes, and I don't think she ever deletes her voicemail. I don't even know if she ever listens to them. However, there are people like me. I actually do listen to my voicemail because I use my phone a lot for work, and I think that voicemails are even less intimidating than phone calls. So what are the things that you can do in order to put reminders out there? So whether it's a text or the direct-to-voicemail service, that you could do messages from all sorts of different people on campus. You could have a message from, a department chair, or the VP of enrollment, or the president if you're an institution that can pull that off. And that can have a very lasting impact on getting students excited about being there. And if the student has like a text transcript, a voicemail tool on their phone, then that could be also a very easy way to get yourself in front of them in a different kind of way, different mechanism, different way of thinking. Yeah. The other thing that I was thinking about is like the fact that Gen Z students are impatient. When I was the director of admissions, again, one of the things I always realized was that transfer students have no patience. And I think that Gen Z students are very similar in that way. It's that if you can't provide an answer in a very short amount of time, then you've lost them. And there are ways that we need to make sure that these students are fully committed to your institution. And if it means, being relentless in how we communicate, then that's what we have to do. So potentially use some things like Hangouts or Appear In to host meetings with parents if that's a helpful thing. Whether they want to talk about FAFSA or getting you ready for the semester. Maybe I had one institution that did like this series of getting ready for move-in. There's all sorts of different ways that you could carve this out. One of the other things you could think about is along the lines of the informational barriers that you might be facing on campus. How do you get other campus partners involved? How do you get your residence lifestyle office to do like a tutorial that you then put on even a go-to meeting or something like that, where you're sitting down and saying, hey, here's the person, the resident director that will be in your housing for the upcoming fall. And we just wanted to give you, afford you this opportunity to talk with them and meet with them and ask any questions that might come up. I mean, just thinking outside the box and being creative when it comes to different things is, I think, going to win the day. The other item there, you probably read it already, but basically, like, how can you use advisors and faculty and other things that will just add texture and get you kind of similar to this webinar, that you get some other voice in there other than just me talking. So that was just a little joke to myself about me being the only one talking. So here is maybe the exhaustive list of questions that stop, Jamie. I know Alicia said in the beginning, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them over. I'd love to, answer questions at the end. We're coming to the end of this PowerPoint, so feel free to send your questions along if you have any, and we'll have some time to take them on. Here are some questions to think about when you're considering your particular melt situation. One, make sure that you understand what melt has historically looked like. And maybe this is a slide I should have put at the beginning, because I think the understanding of your context and the backdrop to your melt scenario is critical. Like if you don't know what melt has looked like, whether it's programmatic or geographic or particular ethnicities and things like that, I think that you need to know that, and you need to understand, like, where are the problem spots. And if you haven't taken time recently, I would say probably this should be done once a year, where you're actually understanding, like, where are these issues. Then you should do that. Get with your institutional research office, help get them to get on board with helping you out, and see where the problem spots might be. I think the scary thing with melt sometimes is that we think in terms of the whole incoming class is vulnerable, and I don't necessarily believe that to be true. I think there are certain subsets that are highly vulnerable, and then for the most part, 60% or 70% of the class that's coming is pretty much coming. You've got them locked down. It's pretty good, but it's spending those resources, that time and energy on that other 30 or 40% that's going to make the big difference. Ask yourself, what strategies have been deployed, and was there any traction? Like, are there metrics in place? Did they work? Are they worth doing again? So things like, sending out another round of invitations to Accepted Student Day, or another, this or that. Fill in the blank. Your comp flow. The things that you have at your disposal. Think through, like, this is really cheap and old of me, but, like, what old inventory do you have in your direct mail stuff, if you have stuff that can be used, can be reused, can be kind of repurposed toward a different end? Like, how can you do that, and what difference would it make? Again, are there particular audiences? Are there early indicators? Here's one that I think has to be really considered highly. One of the tools my team and I used to do is, again, like when we got to April 1st, we would start building a rubric of, like, here are the things that are going to put a student on the at-risk list, at risk for melt. And basically we started publishing that. It was the responsibility of the staff team to keep that fresh and keep it up to date. And, like, what some of those early indicators were critical factors later on, and they played a big role in understanding how do we get in front of it? How is this a systemic issue rather than just a kind of onesie-twosie by the family? Like, what are the things that we can do in order to change this in the long view, rather than just make a short-term difference? So that was a great exercise. It's something that I think should be done often. It's something that your team can be partners in doing, and I would really encourage you to take that on as well. And then, what are the sacred cows? Are there things that you have done that should be sunsetted, should be gotten rid of? Like, are there ways that you can get rid of certain things that are just not effective, or there's systemic roadblocks that lead to melt? Like, sometimes those exist. I'm not even going to attempt to get into that one, because that's like a nerve, but, like, think through, are there certain things that have been done on your campus that can be done away with? Helpful resources. This book, this was a project, a data project that Harvard sponsored a few years ago, I should say. It's pretty long. I found it to be very, very insightful when just kind of thinking about melt in general. I would not assign this as required reading for your counselor team, because they're going to totally not read it. But it's, for those, for the nerds in the group who really like stuff like this, this is a great resource to kind of just help think more in depth about maybe different angles of melt that you hadn't been thinking of before. But I think the big call to all of us is that we can't give up. I stumbled across it. I was, again, in preparation for this webinar, I was reading an article by the Department of Education, and I came across this quote. And maybe it's my context that I never worked at a school that was like this, but the college that assumes that a student isn't coming because they haven't heard from the student themselves, I feel like there's something about that that just doesn't sit well with me. And my encouragement to all of you on the phone is don't give up. And that's coming from a person that's talking to you right now that was a first generation college student that has been impacted to a great degree by my college experience, because it's not just about the numbers. Like, I hope that all of you who are listening realize that this is about changed lives. At the end of the day, the college experience and higher ed is going to change who that student is at their core. And our job is to help make that happen, to be a cog in the wheel of that process. And we can never give up trying on that. So please don't ever assume that students aren't coming. Try again. And that, folks, leads the way for the last question. And I think Alicia will come back on if you've gotten any. Let me just click on
Yeah, thank you, Jamie.
Yep.
Let's see. As a reminder, you guys can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. Let's see what our first question is. All right. It says, you've talked a lot about the process change. Are there other direct marketing ideas that you would recommend to help with MELT?
Oh, yes. So I tried to not necessarily talk about all the cool things that we do with our partners, because I know that sometimes I talk about my experience as the director of admissions and the things that we're doing with our partners a lot. But a number of partners that I am currently working with, and even, obviously, we all have within our paradigm our kind of our yield comm flow and our, the different things that we just normally do, the direct response marketing tools. But I would also, like, things I didn't hit on here are, what are you doing in terms relative to, doing retargeted campaigns off your accepted student site, potentially, building out stories and outcomes that are going out via whether it's household IP targeting or email targeting that are going directly to your admitted and or deposited student, that are really kind of telling the story of your institution. And they don't always have to be transactional, right? Like, it doesn't always have to be, I think that's sometimes we think about email as like, complete your application or come and visit. It's like, there's always some kind of experience at the end that's awaiting them. I think when it comes to the admit and deposit areas of the funnel, direct marketing campaigns can be much more oriented toward outcomes, toward the experience that students are going to get. It can be much more focused on what are the items that await you, paint this big grand experience of studying and being a part of this community. And I would say, if there's room in your budget to put some of those very small, whether it's an admitted student campaign or a deposited student campaign that really tell the story, really talk through outcomes, and maybe even a parent campaign that kind of emphasizes the value of the experience at your institution. I think those are all great tactics, all great things to put in place as we get to this MELT, between now and, let's say, now and August 1 or August 20th or maybe September 15th, depending on who you are.
All right. Question 2. In your experience, what department usually takes the lead in these initiatives or campaigns? Is it admissions or marketing, or departments responsible for retention?
Man, that's a highly subjective question. So my experience, I would think that admissions is going to play a key role as kind of like the conductor, as maybe the boots on the ground. In some of the partnerships that I am affiliated with right now, marketing is like, hey, we have the funds to put together for this sort of campaign. It really depends on the layout of the kind of the organizational structure layout and what the end goal of the initiative actually is. I would say most times, enrollment management is linked to marketing, kind of at the hip, but at the very least at the wrist. I think that there's a lot of items that go in together with that. But I think the big factor too is like, how do you keep the residence life people involved? How do you keep the student experience, at the top of the list, so that you're thinking not just of like continuing the sale language, but also a student experience. So I think that that's probably a little nuanced, probably a little bit subjective relative to institution, but at the same time, I think that those are the groups that have to be critically involved.
Great. Let's see, we've got another one. It says, how are the student concierge social events structured? Can you share any specifics on what you've seen work?
Yes. Okay. So this this was, like I said, a total experiment, and I just made it up. Basically, I had this. So the student for me, and I tend to be a person who doesn't micromanage. So I essentially took this student ambassador for the summer, and I kind of put her right up there in a role that was very much like a full-time employee. Obviously, we had some hourly restrictions so that she wasn't a full-time employee. But essentially, I gave her a list of like, here's what I want to accomplish, and I set her loose. And like I said, she was an individual who had a lot of initiative, but she and I would work together on the data part. So like, where were the hot spots? Where were the regional strongholds that we had to get in front of? And then I would allow her to use whatever mode of communication works best in order to get students on the phone. In some cases, I would see this, even going into if you have a counselor pipeline, where this, the concierge could work with the counselor in order to get like a certain geography if you're geographically, if you're territory based. So I think that there's a lot of flexibility within it. But at the end of the day, what I said to this position was, here's what I want as an outcome. Here's how I think it could work. You can either prove me right or prove me wrong. And at the end of the day, it was an experiment that I think was a positive thing. Now, I think another caveat in that is that students are highly reluctant to be social unless there is an adequate runway. So I think that there was some groundwork that had to be done, and that was done. The institution that I was working with at the time was a very relational institution, so we had very good relationships with the students who were in the pipeline once they got to that level. So I think that had a factor of how successful it was, but I definitely think that it's an idea that's worth trying, because I think that experience can be invaluable. If you can get students to think through, hey, we're a whole bunch of majors, we're a group of majors that are all going to get together at this Starbucks, and this person's going to be the facilitator, but not necessarily do anything other than get everyone together and like let the social part happen. I think that can be very, very powerful, and it definitely will pull away from the melt factor.
Perfect. Let's see, we've got another one. How successful has the Instagram direct messaging concept been? Are you able to track open rates or interactions?
Yes, good question. So it's been highly successful. It's been actually, so if you're listening this afternoon and you're from the Northeast, and we're at May 1, so a lot of institutions right now are really struggling on deposits, and I think that there's a lot of consumer confidence stuff that's going on right now. This partner that has employed this direct messaging through Instagram strategy, they are able to open the open and click throughs on it. I'm not exactly sure how that works on the enterprise level, but I believe they've been able to master that because we had talked about it. They're right now running ahead of their deposit number from last year by almost 10%, and all other levels of the funnel that are impacted by that strategy are also very strong. Their acceptances are up. It's just been a very good year. They haven't done much different than last year. So I think that this is going to be one of those things that at the end of the cycle, we're going to sit down and talk through, like, what's been the real big impact? How can we measure this back to the actual students? And how do we, I like this saying, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. How do we do it more? How do we do it on a different level? How do we kind of, pivot a little bit and add another message or add another modality, a different social media platform to get even bigger exposure? Because not everyone has an Instagram account. Well, maybe everyone who's going to college does have an Instagram account, but I bet you there's at least one student out there who doesn't. So, you know what I'm saying? How do we get other platforms involved?
Great answer. All right, let's see. We've got one more question. It says, is there a way to do marketing automation well without a CRM or with only Banner sans Illusion Recruiter? I might have mispronounced Illusion.
No, you're right. You got it.
Ooh.
Okay, so the best thing I would say when it comes to marketing automation is there are definitely tools that are out there. Some of them are behemoth tools like Marketo that just take a lot of stand up and a lot of process to get involved or to get things off the ground. My recommendation would be honestly to take time to set up a demo with someone from the Capture team, because I think this is all we do is higher ed marketing and marketing automation, and it is because it's all we do, because we're not we don't service retail, we don't do things like that. I think that we do this well, and we have I am one of 5 senior enrollment advisors that basically work on this team, that we've all been directors of admissions or in admissions to a high level of seniority, and we have helped stand up our own campaigns on the other side of the desk where you're coming from. So we really, really care about success and care about how this turns out. So my first and probably only recommendation would be say, yes, there are other ways beyond your CRM. Capture is a great place to start. And we're also, if you have a few dollars left in your budget at the end of this fiscal year and you need a way to spend some of them, then we could be a great way to stand it up for next year. And let me just say one other thing. The great part about marketing automation is that even though it applies very well to Melt, it applies equally well through all other parts of the funnel in creating leads and pulling off anonymous visitors from your website, helping students to complete their application. Like there's a number of different applications that we see and use, and we drive people at Capture using what we call our behavioral engagement platform. So take a look at that. That would be the best thing to do, I think.
All right, and I'm going to stop you there. It's almost time for our presentation to end. So thank you, Jamie, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, Frozen in Place. You've worked hard all year. What are you doing to prevent summer melt?